Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening again. My name is Nadia Rahman from Madison College Career and Employment Services, and today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about interviewing and specifically job interviewing. So, there's a couple things to know before you prepare to go in for a job interview. And first and foremost is that everybody interviews differently. We all have very different personalities, different mannerisms, different comfort levels that will kind of drive how we prepare and present in an interview. So, what I want to talk about today is a little bit about just the general practices that work for any type of interviewer. We'll talk about how to answer questions like, tell me about yourself. We'll talk about behavioral questions like, tell me about a time when you faced conflict in the workplace, which I know is one of everyone's least favorites. I'll also touch on strengths and weaknesses, and then a few things you can do to prepare to be a strong interviewer, no matter what your style or what field you're going into. I also like to start by telling you a little bit about myself, just so you can understand my perspective and maybe include some of my stylistic approaches, or maybe recognize that my style may be very different from yours. So first things first, I am very, very extroverted. I love talking to people. I love being around new people. Being in an interview setting is not necessarily the most uncomfortable thing for me. That being said, I still struggle with interviewing just like everyone else, and that um, they are very challenging and they do make me nervous. And, things like sweaty palms happens to everyone. So I like to clear the air and say that, even with my very outgoing personality, there are still many aspects of an interview that are challenging for me as well. So, going right into talking about job interviewing, you'll see here on the screen I have the first page of our job interviewing guide. Now, your instructor should have sent this to you ahead of time. If not, she will definitely get it to you by the time we're done with this presentation. So you can always come back and review this document. So the purpose of this interviewing guide is very similar to the resume and cover letter guide in that it will walk you through some of the best practices, but it's up to you to determine your own style. So what do we know about interviewing? Well, we know the purpose of a job interview is to get a job. Now, something to take into consideration about interviewing is that every interview should be taken seriously, whether it's a 15-minute phone screening or a 2-hour, 3-hour in person interview. There's a lot of work and time that goes into each type of interview. I like to say that for a 30-minute phone interview, if there's two panelists on the line, that's about 7 hours of work for that company just to do that 30 minutes of phone interviewing. So even phone screening interviews use a lot of company resources, and it means that they're very, very interested in you. So take those seriously. We also know that interviewing is a great opportunity for the company to determine if you're a good fit for the position and their culture. If you talk to anybody in HR, they'll tell you that, while it's really important that a candidate is a strong fit for a position, it's also extremely important that the candidate is a good fit for company culture. So it's important in your interview that you know a little bit about the company culture. The department you're interviewing in, is it based in a big, large headquarter building? Or is it a small family owned? Is it a local business? Will you be working in an office? Will you be working in the field? Knowing things about the job and the company culture will help you adjust your responses to make sure you align with what they're looking for. And it's really important that you're a fit for their culture and that their culture is a fit for you. An example for myself is that if I'm interviewing for a job where I'm expecting to be working directly with people and to be face to face with clients or customers, and I expect to be, interacting with my colleagues and working as a member of a team, and having the opportunity to not just be in an office, in front of a computer all day. And then I learned that the position is actually in an office working by myself, you know, at a computer all day with very little customer or other human interaction. I know that that's not going to be a good fit for me, because what I need in a job to be successful does not align with what that position is offering. And oftentimes you'll learn about some of those differences while you're in the interview. So, as much as they are interviewing you, you can also use an interview, excuse me, to interview the company as well. So some things to consider when you go into the interview. How do you prepare for an interview? This packet that you have will walk you through some things that you can do, but do your homework. Best practice for going into an interview: read the job description. It sounds really silly to say that, but there are often times where we're interviewing for positions here at the college, and it's very, very clear that this person did not read the specific job description for the position that we're interviewing them for. They know a lot about the college, they don't really know a lot about the job that we're interviewing for. So please read the job description. Practice your interview. So if you Google how do I practice for an interview, one of the silliest tips they give you is to sit in front of a mirror and observe your behavior. Yes, it is silly, but it is extremely effective. Um, it's very easy to read your own face or to recognize, oh man, I'm smiling way too much, or wow, I look really angry. Maybe I should smile a bit more. So be honest with yourself and use something like a mirror or a recording to help analyze your body language. Career and employment services, we also offer mock interview practice as well. We can do phone interviewing, and we do have the capacity to do some Skype interviewing if you're willing to be patient with my technology skills. We can definitely set that up as well. And you'll want to come up with a compelling story to tell the interviewer. So when you go into an interview, it's very rare that the company is looking for somebody to give kind of simple, lackluster cookie cutter responses. They want to see a touch of your personality and they want to see, hear more about your story and your background. So be sure to use the interview to tell your story and really make them feel connected to you as a candidate. So, like I said, this guide will talk you through how to prepare for a job interview. And the first thing that I want to focus on is your five-finger pitch, or what you may know as an elevator speech. Now, an elevator speech is very important in an interview because they oftentimes will start the interview with, so why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in this position? There's a wide open question. If they don't tack on the part about why you're interested in the position, when they say, tell me about yourself, it's really, really hard to know, what do I choose to say? How do I know what they want to know? Do they want to know that I'm from Florida and that I love sports and that I'm a runner and, my favorite color is coral? I mean, what do they want to know about me? So if you don't prepare to answer that question of tell me about yourself and introduce yourself to the interviewer or panel of interviewers, right away you may be setting yourself up to feel panic and unprepared for the interview. So prepare for that question of tell me about yourself. So the formula we've come up with is what we call the five-finger pitch. And on page 3 of your guide and on the screen, you'll see a hand. Now, typically, if I was in the class, I'd have you trace your hand and I'd let you draw a turkey or whatever you wanted to do. But we draw your hand because we want each finger to represent a piece of information that you share with the interviewer. So for a visual reference, if you reach down and, as you're talking, your first thing you do is you grab your thumb. So you're talking about whatever your thumb represents. Then you move on to your pointer finger, then your middle finger, and your ring finger. And you can do this very subtly, and the employer doesn't know that your hand is actually helping you stay focused and on track with your response. Now, if you're like me and you say way too much, when I run out of fingers, I know I have to stop talking. For others who are maybe a little bit more quiet or shy or reserved, this gives you 5 concrete things that you can share with the employer that make sure that you have a well-rounded answer. So the five-finger pitch. Now, what are the 5 things we recommend? Well, it really depends on you and your goals and your situation. So I'll share with you 5 things that I typically like to include in my response. So the first thing is just a quick, who are you? You can tell them your name. You can tell them your current school status or graduation status, whether or not you're currently working or in an internship. And that may sound something like the example you see on page 3. So my name is Wolfie and I'm a student at Madison College in the veterinary technician program. Very quick, something easy to share. The second thing, I always like to tell them about my passion. So my background personally is in counseling and working specifically with individuals with disabilities. So when I talk about my passion, I like to tell my story of how I chose my career path and I knew I was, on the right track for what I wanted to do and what I was interested in. For you, your passion might be that you're at this time, you love the business world or the finance world or the insurance world, but you're not really sure what you want to do within. So you're looking for a position that's going to challenge you and let you use the skills you have and give you a chance to develop new skills and help you develop that professional passion that you're looking for. The third thing you can share is your qualification. So a quick summary. You don't want to repeat everything on your resume, but this is a great way for you to highlight some of the things that are most relevant to the job. So if you're applying for a job where communication, public speaking, teamwork are really important. This is an opportunity for you to talk about those skills that are harder to put on paper. The fourth thing that you can share are your goals. So, what are your professional goals for this opportunity? I like to think of this as, what do I hope to gain? So, if offered this position, I'd love the opportunity to use my skill set of skill A, skill B, skill C, but I'd also like to be challenged to learn more about skill set D that maybe I'm not as confident in. So, I'm hoping to gain the opportunity to enhance my skills. And the last thing, why do you want to work for this company? Now, if they ask you that question again later, that's okay. You can go into more detail. But if they don't ask you that, then this is you directly connecting your responses to that company and that position. So tell them what you know about the company. Tell them a little bit about why you're interested in that company specifically as compared to other jobs you might have applied to. So this response works for, tell me about yourself. Sometimes at the end of the interview, they say, is there anything else you want to share with us prior to ending the interview? You can go back and summarize some of these things. Or these are great things to work into any of your responses. So these are 5 things that you want to make sure you share with them throughout the interview. So if they don't give you the chance to do so at the beginning, you want to work some of these things in your other responses. All right, so moving right along, there's a list of some questions that you may see on pages 3 and 4. So, what do you know about our company? What is your work style? What are 5 words your friends would use to describe you? Some things that, these questions can kind of get you thinking about, why do I want this company? Why should this company want me? How do people view me? Other things you can do to prepare, do your homework. So know the background of the company. You should probably know what the company as a whole does. If you're applying for a job in accounting or HR at a company, it's not enough just to know about accounting skills and HR-based skills. You need to know about the company as a whole because you'll be representing the company as a whole. It's sometimes helpful to know who their competitors are so you can say that, I know you're in direct competition with company B. Here's some ways that I think or some ideas I can bring to the company to help you move past that company as a leader in this industry. So you can do your homework on the company and know a little bit about them. And again, reading that job description helps you be prepared for an interview for that specific position. I'm going to talk about interview attire a little bit later on, just because I like to address that in a little bit more detail, but I want to make sure we get through the interview content first. So during the interview, your instructor asked me to talk about general do's and don'ts. So first thing to keep in the do column, always be positive. Even if they ask you a negative question like, have you ever been fired? Or why did you leave your last job? Or tell me about a time when you faced conflict. You always want to keep a positive tone when you're talking about previous experiences or employers. And that can be very challenging if you're not prepared to share the story. So make sure you prepare your stories ahead of time so that you don't find yourself talking negatively about a previous colleague or company when you're really trying to share a specific concrete example of to address whatever they're looking for. So your verbal professionalism is very important. You also want to make sure that you speak clearly. So when we get nervous, sometimes we tend to talk a little bit more quietly, or we're more reserved. When you go into an interview, if you're shy and reserved, that doesn't show much about your personality other than, maybe you're not as interested in being there or you're not confident that you can do the job. So practicing, speaking up and making sure that everyone in the room can hear you is really important, especially in a panel interview where you may be, several feet away from the people interviewing you. You want to make sure that everybody hears the same message. Non-verbally, so about 80% of your communication is nonverbal. It comes in your posture, how you sit in the chair. You all probably can't see me right now, but I'm actually sitting in a really comfortable spinny chair, and I'm having a very hard time kind of keeping myself grounded and not moving around. So if you all were able to see me right now, you might be getting a little bit dizzy just watching me spin back and forth. So being aware of your nonverbal communication, how do you ground yourself in a chair that swivels? Make sure that you sit up straight and you're leaning forward instead of, leaning back looking like you're afraid or disinterested in the people across the table from you. A couple of physical tricks that I have, and you're welcome to try these as you're listening right now in class or at home. When you sit in the chair, one way to ground yourself is to keep your feet flat on the floor, even if you're in a spinny chair. If you focus on keeping, your toes, the balls of your feet, and your heels all on the ground, it's much more difficult for you to swivel back and forth if you really anchor your feet to the ground. I also like to use the back of the chair as a guiding feeling for, am I sitting up in the chair? So if I can't feel any of the chair against my back, I'm leaning way too far forward. I could probably reach across the table and grab their notes if I wanted to. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I want to make sure that I'm not leaning forward the entire time. Now, if you can feel your shoulder blades all the way back on the chair, you're leaning far too far back. So you want to make sure that you can feel your lower up to about your middle back. So just above your belly button, but on your back, you should be able to feel that against the chair. That helps me make sure that I'm sitting upright, I'm up in my chair, but I'm not so far back that I look relaxed. I'm not so far forward that I look overly eager. I'm nicely positioned in the chair with my feet on the ground. Now, if you could see me again, you would also know that I talk with my hands quite a bit. So for someone like me, I use my hands to really express myself, but sometimes I use too much of my hands to talk. So for me, I use the table to help keep my hands grounded. Sometimes I'll put one hand under the table and only talk with my left hand. Or if I know I'm telling a story where I can use my words instead of my hands to convey the message, I'll put both my hands on my lap under the table so that the table serves as a physical barrier. And then I'm not being overly enthusiastic when it's not necessarily an appropriate time to do so. You'll see on page 6, there's a little example of a woman sitting on a box. In the first one, she's leaning too far forward. She looks uncomfortable. The third one, she's like leaning way too far back. She looks afraid or timid or disinterested even. And the third one, she's upright. So if you imagine there's a back to that chair, about half of her back would be touching the back of the chair, and she'd be sitting comfortably with her feet anchored on the ground. And also being aware of your facial expression. So when they ask you a question, it's okay to, tilt your head and lean in and nod like you understand the question. Bringing notes to an interview is completely acceptable. So bring in a nice folder with some pre-written notes that you can refer back to as you respond to their questions. You can also take notes while you're in the interview as well. So if you ask a question at the end or at the beginning and you want to make sure you capture the response, whenever you ask a question, it looks really good for you if you actually write down what they say. It shows that you're interested and you care about the response. So those are just a couple of the do's and don'ts of your physical presence during the interview. So moving on to page 8 and 9. So this is where we get into some of the types of questions. So in-person behavioral questions. These can also be asked over the phone. So I want to focus on the term behavioral questions. We like to use what we call the STAR method. In high school or at another school, you may have heard CAR. Very, very similar. We just prefer STAR because we can draw pretty pictures with stars. So these questions are, tell me about a time when you effectively worked under pressure, or tell me about a time when you faced conflict in the workplace. My absolute least favorite, tell me about a time when you failed. It's rude, but okay, I'll answer your question anyways. So when they ask you these questions, I mentioned earlier that you need to stay positive. This formula helps you make sure that you deliver a clear message and you don't set yourself up to talk about parts of the story that aren't important. So the things that they want to know, they want to know the S and the T of STAR, the situation or the task. Again, if you're in my office, we'd be taking notes together and I'd write, stick to the facts. So if they say, tell me about a time when you faced conflict in the workplace, what are the facts of that story? You had a colleague or a manager or a customer, so who were you working with? What was the conflict? You were assigned to a project and you had different ideas about deadlines, or you had different communication styles with letting each other know where you were on the project or on the progress of the project. Situation, who were you working with? What was the source of the conflict? I don't particularly care to know how annoying that person was, or how unreliable they were, or how much you didn't like them, or who else didn't like them. That's not factual. That's your own opinion of the person or the situation. So stick to the facts. The next thing they want to know in STAR is the action you took. Again, in my office, I'd highlight the word you because I'm trying to hire you. So what did you do in that situation to manage the negative or positive situation? So what was your action? And then R stands for the result. A little bit of bonus information you can include is the result and what did you learn? So, I learned that by speaking up and advocating for what I thought we needed to do to complete the project on time, I learned why the other person was working with the work ethic they were, and we were able to come to terms on how we could actually work together instead of, thinking one person was lazy and the other person was doing too much. So what was the outcome, and what did you learn? And you'll see there's an example at the bottom of page 8 as well. And that works for positive or negative behavior questions. So a positive question would be, tell me about a time when you set a goal for yourself and how you followed through on reaching that goal. A negative question would be, tell me about a time when you face conflict in the workplace. They're asking for a negative experience. Sometimes those negative experiences have positive outcomes. Again, going back to what did you learn, that's a great way to put a positive twist on a negative experience. Another question that I like to address is strengths and weaknesses. And while it's not directly on the screen right now, there's a couple things that you want to keep in mind. So the first thing you want to keep in mind with strengths, the strength should be directly related to the job. So one example that I see quite a bit from students is that, one of my strengths is I'm very good at video games. Well, if you're going into nursing, it's really hard for me to draw a parallel between video games and nursing. So that's fine if your strength is that you're good at video games, but I need you to tell me the deeper connection. So, are you good at video games because you like the problem solving aspect of it? Okay, as a nurse, I could definitely see where that's useful. Are you good at video games because you play on a team and for your team to do well, you have to communicate and you have to let each other know what you're going to do next to work towards, helping your team be successful. Okay, as a nurse, that is definitely a useful skill, but I wouldn't get that from, your strength being I'm good at video games. I need you to kind of spell it out for me and directly relate your strength to the job that you're applying to. Same thing goes for weaknesses. So people are oftentimes afraid to share a weakness, and we all have them. That's the reality. Doesn't matter if this is going to be your first job or your last job in your career. You have weaknesses, so don't be afraid to share those with the employer. The way I recommend you share a weakness would be to say, one of my weaknesses is, a common example, public speaking. I get very, very nervous when I have to speak in front of a group, but I know that in my career that's going to be part of my job. So when I have to public speak, here's the things that work best for me. I've learned that if I know I'm going to speak in front of a group, I have time to prepare, I'm much more comfortable going into it. I prefer that I'm speaking about subjects that I'm knowledgeable in. I don't really enjoy or haven't been as successful in situations where I'm put in front of a group and I kind of have to improv as I go. That's much, much more challenging for me. And if that were something that I would have to do in the job, I would love to sit down with somebody who's good at that and learn from them as to how they develop that skill. So you can tell them that you're terrified of talking in front of groups, but if you give them the parameters of, what you're, what tools you have now that you've developed that help you do that skill or overcome that weakness, then they learn, okay, you don't love public speaking, but you can do it. I just know that I need to give you notice. Completely fair. And the weakness should be something that you've already started to overcome. So don't share a weakness that, is something that you have no idea how you're going to approach. A silly example, one of my weaknesses is I'm a terrible cook. I have no knife skills. I'm really good at, having a sanitary and clean kitchen, but cannot chop vegetables or make food look presentable to save my life. So it's very rare that I offer to cook for people. And I have, I've not even tried to approach that weakness. I just know that I'm not a good cook. If I were going into the culinary field, that would be a really bad example. So instead, I could say, prior to going to Madison College for the culinary program, I was a terrible cook. I didn't have safe knife skills. I didn't have an understanding of different food temperatures and how they need to be prepared to be safe. But what I learned while I was in school was, A, B, C, and D. And so using that as my platform, I've become a much better cook. I've worked in restaurants, I've done internships, I've learned from trained professionals, and now I can actually say I'm a really, really good cook. But if you had asked me what my weakness was 2 years ago, I would have had to tell you I'm a terrible cook. And now I'm ready to start my career in culinary. So your weakness could be something that you've already overcome. Just make sure you can identify what did you do? How can you prove to me that this is now actually no longer a major weakness for you? Other types of interviews to be prepared for, phone interviews. So it's really hard to gauge a person's reaction when you can't see them. So when I have phone interviews or I conduct phone interviews, I always like to let students know that silence is not a bad thing on the phone. If you've used star or your five finger pitch or you've given enough detail in your response, silence from the other line typically means that they're still making notes and that they're just trying to catch up with what you said. So I definitely, don't panic if I hear silence. Now, if you know you've said something inappropriate or you've said something that is not what you meant to say and you haven't really explained it, and you hear silence, they may be waiting for more. But if you feel like you've given a strong answer, that silence is just them trying to take notes and capture what you've said. For phone interviews, I still recommend that you dress the part. Be sure that you're in a quiet, professional environment. Um, it's really sometimes your home is more comfortable, but it's really a bad thing if you're doing a phone interview and the dog is barking or the kids are running around in the back or the teapot is screeching and all things that maybe you can tune out but on the phone are picked up very dominantly. You want to be sure that your environment reflects what you would want an in-person interview environment to feel like. Video chat interviews, these are becoming more and more popular, especially if you're applying to jobs outside of your regional area. So a couple things to keep in mind. Assume that you're accidentally going to stand up while you're on the interview, and they can see your entire outfit. So make sure you have a belt on, you have shoes on, your pants are ironed just like your shirt. Practice looking at the camera prior to the interview. So if you find that your webcam is on a very low angle, make sure you can find a way to prop it up so they can actually see your entire face instead of just your chin. Same thing goes for if it's too tall. You want to make sure that the angle they have reflects your professionalism. So try to be as straight on with the camera as you can. We have this thing we talk about, a digital handshake. So make sure that you wave and smile and you acknowledge that you can hear them and see them and that they can hear and see you. So think, an in-person handshake is really, really important. Your digital handshake is how you set the first impression when you're not there physically in person. And test your equipment beforehand. Please make sure your mic works and your camera works and your computer is charged or connected to the charging port. Download Skype ahead of time. Practice using Skype if you've never used it before. So practice all the technology things ahead of time. Don't try to figure that out the day of. There's a couple of other types of interviews. So interviewing over a meal, what to order, what is dining etiquette, things like that. Not as common, but can happen. And then panel interviews. So if you are in person or on the phone, be sure that you make eye contact with each person. So if you find that you're staring at the person in front of you the whole time, make sure you share the love and you look at the person to their left and to their right. If somebody introduces themselves and they say, "I'm from HR," and the person next to them says, "I'm a fellow accountant, just like you'll be if you get the job," make sure that you talk to each person. You can say, "As a fellow accountant, here's something that you want to know about me. As an HR person who represents the company, here's things you want to know about me." And it's okay to directly tailor your response to a particular person on the panel. Page 11 has some information on discrimination. Extremely rare that they ask illegal questions, but know the difference between a legal and an illegal question if that's something you're interested in learning about. And then the rest of the packet has a little bit about how to prepare for an interview. So there's an interview prep handout, so knowing about the company, doing your information seeking. Page 13 has a blank hand for you to write out your five-finger pitch. It has an opportunity for you to write down a few strengths and weaknesses. I recommend you have 2 to 3 at least of each. If that way, if they ask you, what is your biggest strength and what is your biggest weakness? Okay, you've got one ready to go. If the question is, what are some of your strengths and some of your weaknesses, you need to give more than one example. There's an example chart in here where you can practice star for some different categories if you're interested in, and then always bring questions that you want to ask the employer. One of my favorite questions is, what opportunities do you offer for professional development and training for your new staff? Another question you can ask is, what is the training procedure? What is the training calendar schedule look like for a new employee, so you can learn how they onboard you into the company? Questions to avoid in a first interview or a phone screening. Don't ask about pay or about benefits. Let them ask you. If they ask you, what are your salary expectations? If you've done your research on the company and on the job title, then you'll know what the average entry level or mid-level salary is, and you can respond with a range. So the bottom end of your range should never be lower than a number you could actually accept. For example, if you need to make $10 an hour, you don't want to give a range of 9 to 11, because if they offer 9, you likely can't accept that. So you want to set yourself up to at least be able to accept the lowest number you offer. Do your research. Use Glassdoor, use onetonline.org to research different job titles to know what the national and local salary information is. And then be prepared with a range. And they may ask you that in the first interview. You don't want to ask that in the first interview. And then another thing I recommend you do is come up with a list of examples. So I also sent out a list to your instructor of different categories to prepare. I highly recommend you come up with 2 to 3 examples of each. That way that, it doesn't matter what question they ask you. If you use an example for question 1 and they ask you a similar question in question 5, you don't have to use the same example twice. You can actually give them more examples from your experience and background. So again, I'm from Career and Employment Services. We are located at the Truax campus, but we do have advisors in the regionals as well who would love to work with you. The best way to get a hold of us is to call 608-243-4598 to set up an appointment. Again, we can do in person, over the phone, or